Hello everyone. As I said, nice to see you for today's Open Science Kitchen event. Before we start, just a typical information overload on slide 1. I'm happy to announce that we have a student initiative for open science. If you are in contact with students, please make them aware of it. For example, in teaching classes, you can get all the information on the website. The kitchen will be closed for 2 months, and most likely we will be back in September with a fresh set of topics. As always, if you want to stay informed, join the Open Science Community Twente as a member, and you will receive regular updates. In the meantime, you might want to watch or rewatch some of the past Open Science Kitchen events in case you missed some of them. Just visit the website. There you will find all the slides and materials. Today I'm happy to present our guest speaker, Dennie Hebels. He will talk about engaging society, how public outreach meets open science. Dennie has a background in toxicology, toxigenomics, and regenerative medicine. In all these topics, he had a strong focus on big data, and in one of his projects, he also worked on Seedbit, which is a data repository. Now he works as a project manager and also fulfills the role of a data steward who provides support with data management activities. Of course, he is also a member of the Open Science community in Maastricht. And yeah, that's it from my side. Now it's time to hand over to Dennie.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. You can see it already?
I can see the, I think it's not a presentation mode.
No, not yet. I think
okay,
it is, right?
Now it's a presentation
there
mode.
There we go, perfect. Okay, great. Yeah, well, Marcus, thank you very much for inviting me to present here. It was actually a nice surprise also to see you inviting me to talk about outreach, because it's something that we do quite a lot in the institute that I work at. But it's not something that I've ever given a presentation on. So I actually really had to make one from scratch. Of course, I had material and everything laying around, but it was actually quite a fun journey to put this together, because I also learned some new things along the way, and I hope that I can transfer that knowledge also to you now. Yeah, so as Marcus already said, right, so this is all about public outreach and also how that meets up and connects to open science. And while Marcus already gave a bit of a quick intro on who I am, I'll just quickly go over this again here. So indeed, I did a PhD and a couple of postdocs in Maastricht University. Actually, I've always been there. I never really left. And that was back in the day when I did PhD. And at some point, I moved over to the Merlin Institute, which is a regenerative medicine institute. See a few pictures there of our office and our labs. And where I started also as a postdoc, but at some point I kind of felt like, yeah, I don't really want to stay in research. It's not really the thing that I see myself doing for the rest of my life. So I made a bit of a change in direction and became first project leader. And then also because of my background with a lot of data, kind of data stewardship that sort of came with the territory in a way. And by now I'm also a project manager. I'll also explain a little bit more about what that really entails, because it can be a little bit vague sometimes. As Marcus also already mentioned, I'm a member of the Open Science community in Maastricht, which again, that's very strongly also related to that data stewardship, because I deal a lot with the data management in the Merlin Institute. Really dealing with stuff from experiment planning to data archiving and everything in between. And I was already kind of promoting this open science behavior in Merlin, and then this opportunity to join the OSCM came on. I thought, yeah, that's going to be really interesting, right, to join in with that, because I can basically do there what I've already been doing within Merlin. So there I'm now also the faculty ambassador, and the faculty is Faculty of Health, Medicine, and Life Sciences. And of course, we all connect also with all of the other open science communities in the Netherlands and even abroad. We also have a few members there. So just to give you a quick idea of what the OSCM organizes, and I guess you probably have similar kinds of events in Twente as well. But one of our things that we've been doing since this year is a Fair Coffee lecture series, where we just invite researchers over to explain how they applied FAIR to the research, kind of with the goal to also inspire other people to do the same. We have a reproducibility journal club. I think you also have that one in Twente, where we just would discuss papers and things to do with improving science, reproducibility, and of course the open science movement as well. And we also offer workshops on how to become FAIR, right? To really teach people some essential skills that they can use to apply in their own research. So that project management thing, like I said, that's a little bit vague sometimes. So it's not project management of like research projects, right? Because like I said, I kind of moved away a bit from the research. I'm still a little bit connected to it, but I'm definitely not doing research anymore. But these are really management projects that are kind of meant to improve like the general operation of Merlin. That's kind of the idea there. And so that involves things like data management projects, the website development. We had that like a year or two ago. We have this annual magazine that requires quite a bit of work. And I coordinate the education in Merlin, research grant overviews, and then keeping them up to date. And I also spend some time on writing non-research related grant proposals, things like related to open science, right? You might have seen the NWO Open Science grant, so also submitted a proposal there. I think along with, I think more than 100 people submitted there, so there's some tough competition there, I think. And also outreach related grant proposals. And of course, that's kind of what we're here to talk about today, right? So I also coordinate part of the outreach activities that we do in Merlin, because some people just do these things on their own, but there's also some activities that we really do as a team together. And that's really what I would like to focus on for today. But just like a little bit of an intro, of course, what is outreach, right? So that's really just to connect, inform, and also get feedback from often specific groups within the community. And that can be, of course, on science topics, right? So this presentation tends to focus a little bit more on the science part of it, of course, because of my background in science, but this could technically as well apply to, for example, government policies, right? So governments or local governments, they can also very easily do outreach activities and involve the general public in them. And then often they're directed at like specific groups, because some things are just really meant for a specific group in society. And some examples are like public talks and lectures, and like the TED talks, right? You're all familiar with them for sure. Visiting also primary and secondary schools, right? Or have them visit the institute, organizing workshops for teachers or students, and also supporting science fairs or similar kinds of events. I thought it might actually be fun to do a really brief history of outreach, because as I was working on this presentation, I thought, that's actually quite interesting to see how that developed, because for many centuries, right, when science really started to happen, outreach was really not a thing that was being done, right? Outreach was just something unheard of, and scientists just did their thing, and that was it, and that all stayed within their own science community, and often scientists wouldn't even be aware of each other on the type of research that they were doing, right? But that kind of started to change at the beginning of the 19th century, and like the 1820s, there's a few examples here. For example, Michael Faraday, he organized some of the first public lectures at the Royal Institution, and they were like the Christmas lectures, they were called. And as you can see also in this drawing here, which I'm just going to assume is a representative drawing of what was actually happening there, you really see an audience that consists of adults and children. So it was really a public lecture meant for anyone to attend. And another example is Alexander von Humboldt. He delivered a lot of public lectures also at the University of Berlin in 1827. And those were really kind of the first examples of these kinds of outreach activities. Then I think it kind of stayed like that for a while, because I mean these lectures that happened quite often. But really the popularization of science, that's something that you really start noticing around the 1970s and 90s, 80s and onwards. Because then you of course also still had these lectures, but also lots of books were written, documentaries were made, like for example on Discovery Channel, right? There was a lot of documentaries there as well, really meant to popularize science. And those are really also examples of outreach activities, because they really normally invited scientists on the show, or they wrote a book, and really meant to address a really broad audience. But it was still not very involved, right? It was more really the scientists doing the work, telling people about something, but not really involving them in anything. This was kind of like a one-way traffic, really. And then some famous scientists from around that time, also a little bit later on, for example, were Stephen Hawking, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Mikio Kaku. I'm sure you know most of them. For sure, you know Stephen Hawking. They're all related to physics in one way or another. And of course, one of these, I'm sure you've seen him all over the place because he really tended to show up in all kinds of TV shows as well. Of course, that was Stephen Hawking because he's been in The Big Bang Theory, The Simpsons, Little Britain, and of course also Star Trek: The Next Generation, and joined here by Einstein and Newton, of all people, and Data, of course, in the back there, right? Because I'm also a bit of a Star Trek nerd myself, so I really loved it when I saw this episode. I can still remember. And in a way, these are also outreach activities, right? Of course, they're not really meant to address to people, but it also kind of helps with popularizing science and making people more interested in it. And then I think in the last 20 to 30 years, you kind of see a change where this outreach becomes more involved and there's more things like demos taking place, more kind of activities, workshops where people really have a bit of an interaction with the scientist. And yeah, that was a really nice development actually, and that's still ongoing, of course, today. So it's actually then also quite easy to see how outreach relates to open science, because of course open science is all about sharing data, right? Sharing research and making that really accessible to everyone. So there shouldn't really be any barriers for people to access the science that was done, and that is both at the amateur and the professional level. And of course, two examples that really relate to this are open data and open access, right? So open access papers. So by doing this, you technically make research available to everyone, right? So to also like the amateurs in society, to everyone, young and old. But of course, these papers and also these data sets, they're way too technical to understand for most people, because you really need to have a science background to do anything with them. So even though it's open, it's not very useful. And if you really want to involve people that don't have a science background with this kind of open science, you really need to use a different approach, and that's really all about interacting with people at the right level. So understanding your audience, basically. And that's really where the public outreach or the science communication, because that's also often what it's called, that's where that comes in. So then you could, of course, also ask your question that might be good to start off with this: why is outreach good? I guess, of course, you can do these things, but what's the point of doing it? Isn't it just like a big waste of time? Well, but there's all kinds of reasons why it's a good thing, and I think I've summarized here the 5 most important points. One being, of course, awareness. It's really important to promote public awareness so that people also increase their understanding of science, and very importantly, also decrease the mistrust in science, as we also witnessed in the last year, of course, with the pandemic, right? There's a lot of mistrust in the vaccinations and all kinds of crackpot theories about chips in vaccines and Bill Gates, etc. So there's some crazy stuff going on, and that's something that needs to be tackled, because it can really have very very intense consequences for society as a whole. Public support, of course, is another one, and it's kind of related to awareness, but it's not the same, because you might be aware of the science and kind of understand why it's being done, but it could be that some people then simply still don't really support it. And it is good to have the support of the general public to be carrying out the science. And I'll also go into all of these topics in a little bit more detail later, so I'll also explain a bit more about this one. Another point is identifying the needs of your of society, basically, right? So which societal issues are considered important, and that's important to know, because you also want to be working on things that benefit society. If you're doing, for example, research on a thing that will eventually not really benefit anyone, then that's not really the greatest thing, probably, in the grand scheme of things. And education, of course, is another very obvious one, right? It's a great way of making contributions to science education. often more informal contributions, right? Because the real education is, of course, what you get in school, but outreach can really add something to that. And a last point is like career motivation, because you can really use outreach also to motivate students to choose for a career in science or a career in any other topic that you want to make more popular. So just to go into these 5 things in a little bit more detail. So first of all, the awareness. So like I said, it's really about creating public awareness and understanding of what scientists do in order to also decrease the mistrust in science. And in a way, and this is a term that's often used then when you're talking about this topic, is there's a digital critical illiteracy, meaning that a lot of people kind of lack the skills to critically assess digital information that they see, right? So if they see some information coming by on Facebook, for example, they don't really have the right skills to determine whether something is true or whether it isn't. And that's really a thing that we kind of need to work on also as a science community, I guess, because this will eventually diminish also the effect that fake news has, right? If people just take a minute to reassess and just dig a little bit deeper and see if something is really true, then the effect of fake news would be much less. And as an example here was some study that was done in can't remember exactly where it was, but they kind of tested. They wanted to investigate what kind of fake news has the biggest impact, right? So they kind of had a false story about that claimed that rice was being made out of plastic, and they tested this with just a text message, right? So it was just a text explaining this process, an audio file of somebody explaining this, and then a video where you kind of see this supposedly happening. And then what you see is that the credibility, right? So the level to which people tend to believe what they're reading, hearing, seeing, that's really the highest with the video. So video evidence, supposed evidence, apparently has really the most effect on convincing people of something. And then what they also see there is that the more involved you are with an issue, so the more important you consider something to be, the more likely you're also to believe what you're seeing. If it's something you really don't care about, then you might see a video of someone making rice out of plastic, but then you think that whatever, and then you don't really tend to believe it. And this is like I said, it's something that really spreads very easily through social media, right? Because you can just at an exponential rate, you can reach people all across the world, so it can really have a very strong impact really fast. And then if you try to tackle this problem by, for example, debunking it on the news, that usually has very little effect, because people often tend to also mistrust the news. So even though you are coming up with all kinds of reasons why a certain thing is not true, they'll just say, yeah, sure, they're all in on it, right? So you get that kind of effect. So news really doesn't help with decreasing that effect. And just to give you an example here, I'm not going to show the video. It's not even an active video, but it's just a screen still that you see there, and that already kind of explains the whole thing. So this was a video that was going around some months ago, I think about half a year ago, when in Australia the first vaccinations were being rolled out. And at some point you saw this video spreading all over the place. So on Facebook, I saw it also myself showing up in certain feeds, and it was supposedly a proof that the premier of I think it was New South Wales in Australia didn't really get the vaccination. So they have this screenshot. They zoomed in, and then you saw that the cap was still on the syringe. So she didn't actually get the vaccination. And then, of course, a whole story started spreading about this being fake, the politicians lying to us, and you can imagine the kind of effect that it had. But then, if you dig a little bit deeper, because I saw this thing, I think this cannot possibly be true. So I just Googled it, and within a minute, I found already the proof that it was just total nonsense, because the video itself is actually correct, but it's only part of the video. So you actually don't see what happened before. And what happened before was she actually got the vaccination with the cap off, so it really went into the arm. But the press that was present there, they weren't in the right position to take pictures and to make a proper video. They didn't have the right angle. So they said afterwards, could you reenact the vaccination again, so we have better material to put on, in a newspaper, on our website, etc. And so she did. And then, of course, some people, the ones that are behind this, they just cut out the piece where that second event happens where they cap on, and then they spin this story, which is of course complete nonsense. And that just shows how easy it is to manipulate people, but just you being very selective in what you show people. And again, this video, video evidence has really the strongest effect there. So what is very important is to tackle this, right, and to make sure that digital critical literacy that is taught in schools, that people learn to understand and critically look at evidence they're presented with to determine whether something is true or not, or at least determine it to the best of their ability if whether something is true. And there's also something where universities can help out with, also with outreach initiatives. So then to go on to the public support one. So like I said, it's essential to have the support of the public, simply because a lot of the science that we do and a lot of research it's funded by public taxes, right? So we, of course, all ourselves, but everybody in society is basically paying for the research that's being done. So it kind of makes sense to do something that the public can also support. And just to give you an example here of the Netherlands, I mean, this is written in Dutch, but it's not that important. You can see the most important information there. And then here you see the like the public fund. So 36% of money in the Netherlands is going to public research. But then within that one, like 94% of that heap of money, that goes to the public institutions and higher education. So basically, it means that within the universities, the vast majority of the research being done there is being paid from taxes, and that just that kind of shows why we sort of owe it to the public to do stuff that they also support or that they also understand. Because the understanding part, that's really important to get the support. And what you want to prevent is that people really start protesting and saying, yeah, not with my tax dollars, right, as Americans often say. And so this is really something to always keep in mind when you're doing research and when you're thinking about doing outreach and explaining things to the wider community. Then about the identification of needs. So it's with public engagement can really help researchers to get closer to the societal issues and to questions that people have in society, because it also helps you to profit from input and ideas that come from outside your academic bubble, right? And then as a result, that identify what needs there really are in society. And a good example of that is getting input from patient organizations, because talking to the people that you actually do the work for in the long run, that is really important to sometimes come up with new ideas or make modifications to existing ideas you had going on or existing projects based on this input. And it can also help you to like reprioritize goals, right? Because sometimes it happens that we're just doing things that in the end is not something that the patient is really expecting to happen, right? Sometimes they might have different views on how to improve their lives, and that can actually provide you with some really valuable feedback. And there's an example here from a RecMed XB project, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that one later. Then, of course, the education part, right? So, like I mentioned, it can really help with filling some gaps in knowledge, or partially filling them with these outreach activities. And that's something that can take place, of course, at primary and secondary education levels, right? So there's really no limits to this, and it can be on any kind of topic, right? Like I said, again, you see the science thing, of course, on the right, but on the left, we have a soldier there, and I'm not sure what the guy with the beard is doing, but he doesn't really look like your average scientist. So there's really outreach that can happen on all kinds of different levels. And schools also usually tend to welcome these kinds of opportunities because they are often pressed for time, right? Of course, they have their own agenda, they have their own goals to meet, and they don't always have the time, resources, or knowledge to teach certain topics. So if you go there and say, hey, what, we would like to come over and you present something to your students, they are usually very positive about these kinds of opportunities. And then this last thing that I also mentioned before, right, of the 5 reasons why outreach is important, the career motivation, of course, because it can really help you by doing outreach to increase numbers of students in a certain field, right? It can be in science, but of course it can also be in any other field, because sometimes there's really a need for people in a certain field. And one way of doing that is doing outreach and trying to get them more interested, more motivated to choose for that kind of career opportunity. And of course, this can also be directed at specific groups in society, right? For example, girls. So there are a lot of initiatives to increase the number of girls choosing exact sciences. One example here being a Girls' Day that's organized by the VHTO. And this is also, it's an outreach event where all kinds of organizations, so that can be universities, but also companies, kind of open their doors for a day. And then girls between the ages of 10 and 15 can go there and take part in all kinds of different activities to really increase their interest in the STEM area. And so those were those 5 reasons, but there's actually another reason. It's also a lot of fun, and it can be very inspirational to do outreach. It's a great team building exercise, right? Because usually you do this with a team of colleagues. You can also reach out to different departments, for example, in your university to do this. So it's really nice to work together with people and build something. And of course, like I said, you meet a lot of new people then, not just people you work with to set it up, but of course also the audience that comes in, ranging from young to old, with all kinds of different backgrounds. So that can also be really a lot of fun. And of course, if you participate in these outreach activities, it can also be very stimulating to the scientists themselves, and it really enhances creativity and motivation. So that's where you really see this two-way street thing coming in, right? Where you really have an interaction between both, instead of just a one-directional lecture where you just say something and nothing comes back. I would just like to, because I think I still have the time for this, to show you some outreach examples that we do within Merlin, so just to give you a little bit of an idea of what kind of activities these could be. So one of them here you see is lectures at high school. So this is a high school in Maastricht, where we go every year and give we start with a lecture on regenerative medicine, just explain what we do, what kind of research it is that we do, show them some examples. You see that actually in the picture on the bottom, you see some implants that are used, right, for artificial hips, for example. And they also do some activities to just get a good idea of what regenerative medicine is all about. And to some of these students, then there's an opportunity to do a mini internship. And that's part of something called the profielwerkstuk in Dutch. It's like a report that students need to make in the last year of their high school, and it needs to be of some kind of a societal topic. It needs to be like really a project where they have to go out and do something and then write about it. And so we invite small groups over then to Merlin, and then you can just do research for about a week. Write a report on, of course, interact with the scientists, and then that's what they're basically then being graded on in their high school. And it's a really nice way for them also to see whether a career in science is something for them, because they're very close to making the decision on where to go, right? If they want to, what kind of university study, for example, that they would like to choose. Then the public lecture. So this is something that I'm sure you're in Twente also familiar with. And here I just picked a few examples. On the left there you see a TEDx talk by Clemens van Ditterswijk. He was like the founder also of the Merlin Institute, and the former director. Right now that's Pamela Biebervies, who you see here in the middle. Also giving that was the Science Gala for New Scientists, where she gave a talk. She also recently did this eye-opener pitch, which are just like small videos to easily explain what kind of research it is that we're doing. And here on top, you see kind of an example of it's not really technically a public lecture, but it is, of course, a way to reach a large audience, is by giving interviews in TV shows, for example. So you see here Pauw, that's quite a famous talk show in the Netherlands for those who are not familiar with Dutch TV. And this was, again, Clemens van Ditterswijk, who was there talking about artificial kidneys in this case, where they also had some patients come over and explain their side of the story. So there again, you see that interaction also with patients. That is very important in outreach. Another example is what I already quickly mentioned before. That's really to do with interacting with patient organizations. And that's really to stimulate patient-included research, as we call it. And yeah, this example here is about the RecMedXB. RecMedXB is a big project that Merlin is also involved in. And they have just like an annual day where they, of course, present results on how everything is going with the research, etc. But they also invite patient organizations over, so from different well-known organizations in the Netherlands, like the Hartstichting, Nierstichting, so new cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, diabetes, etc. And they were all invited over also to discuss how to communicate realistic expectations to patients, because there's really a high demand for that kind of communication, because often patients simply don't know what they can expect. And researchers also are often a little bit too far away from the hospital, right? So it really helps to connect those two and just make sure that patients are also given realistic expectations of how, for example, their disease can improve in the future. And then, of course, it's also important to identify really pertinent cases to study, right? So which things do patients themselves consider to be the most important to focus on? And this was actually the first time we did that in 2020, and it's something that we're going to repeat also, because the feedback we got there was really very valuable. And then the last example I'd like to show is actually one that's coming up in September. We're planning this event, and it's called CSI Mistake. I think most of you know CSI, right? It's this crime show where they always solve some kind of a murder by doing all kinds of fascinating experiments in the lab. It always goes much faster there than it actually does in reality, but I guess that's TV for you right there. And what this day is about is really to offer a day of science to primary school children in this case. And it's for them to learn about cell biology, by following a fun lecture, doing some games, together with some of the researchers. Of course, our teachers are also involved in it. And the idea is really there to also do some experiments in the lab. And it's not just going to the lab and just doing some random experiments, but that's where the CSI thing comes in. It's really to solve a fake crime case, obviously, using DNA analysis. So the idea is there that there's been a murder. Actually, the victim you see laying on the ground, that's actually me. It's a picture from quite some years ago, but it's me. So I was murdered at some point. And the idea for them is to solve this crime case, right, by doing a DNA isolation. Again, this is in Dutch, because it's just a protocol that they get to mix a few things together and then isolate DNA. And then at the end, they will just get these DNA patterns, and they have to see which one of these four suspects matches the evidence that was found at the crime scene, and then they can just use that to identify who was the murderer in this case. And this is really a very fun event. I mean, it might sound a little bit dark, but it really isn't. You do this in a very positive way, and the kids are very excited always about this kind of thing. So this is actually one of my favorite outreach activities that we do. And maybe by now you're wondering, so yeah, doesn't this take a lot of time, right? I mean, is this something that we can afford to do? Because I think there's a lot of researchers that are a bit reluctant still to engage in these public outreach activities, because it takes up a lot of time, right? Of course, you have to spend some hours to set it all up, and of course to carry it out. And researchers are already under a lot of pressure, because you have a lot of stuff to publish, a lot of things to write. So I totally understand that, of course, because I've had exactly the same thing happen. And another problem there is that these public outreach activities it's not really reflected in any kinds of metrics that are used to check how well you're doing in your career, right? Because you often have like the age index to name an example, like how many papers you publish, how many citations you got, and outreach is often not really included in that. And so then you again might wonder, so why would I put so much effort into something when I'm not really being measured on these kinds of activities? But there was actually a study that was done quite recently, 2 years ago, and they kind of tried to answer this question whether doing public outreach is something that impedes the research performance, right? So does doing a lot of outreach, does that mean that you actually put out less research of a lesser quality? And the conclusion of that study was actually quite the opposite. It found that research performance, so measured in terms of numbers of papers published, numbers of citations, impact factor, all of those things, was actually positively associated with engagement in public outreach activities. So the more outreach people did, actually the better also their research performance was. And that's really an insight, as they also concluded there, that should have implications for the academic incentive and evaluation system. Because again, if you look back at this engagement in public outreach and how that's not reflected in any of the metrics, that should really be happening if apparently doing outreach can really improve your research, right? I mean, that's really an argument in favor of also evaluating the outreach that you do. And fortunately, you do see that this is kind of changing. One example, for example, here being this NWO program that they started last year. It's a new call from the NWA, which is part of NWO. And that has everything to do with science communications. It's 1 million euros again that they make available to really carry out these science communication or outreach events. So you really see that this is changing. And another thing where I very recently saw this is that, for example, Merlin now has to write this 5-year evaluation report. I'm sure that's also something that a lot of you also run into. Like every number of years, you have to write an evaluation. It often goes by research schools in the university, just to show how you did, etc. And right now, outreach is also one of the things that that you are required to put in there, and that they actually pay a lot of attention to. So it is really becoming something that you're also being evaluated on, and that you're also expected to do. So it's not just something you do on the side; it's really part of being a researcher nowadays. That's actually the way to look at it. I'm actually now almost at the end of my presentation. I think this is the last slide, if I'm not mistaken. I would just like to give you a few tips maybe on how to organize outreach activities yourself if you're not already doing them, right? But one way of course doing this, of course you need a budget usually, right, to do this. Of course you also need people, but the people we have, budget we don't always have. But there's always the department, school, or faculty where you can see if there is something available there. Often they will have small amounts of budget, and you don't need that much to organize these kinds of activities. But what I can also really recommend is to contact your marketing and communications department, because they often have the right connections also to put the right people with you to organize certain things, of course to promote it also, right? They often have already connections with schools also to set up these kinds of events. They can help you with booking rooms, etc. For the event to take place. And so, yeah, at least we find that, at least in Maastricht, the marketing and communications department can really help out with that. And then coming again back to the budget thing, of course, there's also the possibility to apply for outreach grants, right? I already mentioned them in the beginning, because I try to write these as well, and hopefully also get them. And actually, we got lucky this year, because at the beginning of the year we received the KNAW Science Communication Fund, which is a nice one, because there we again have a nice little budget available to organize all kinds of different events. But there's a whole bunch of different ones out there. I've mentioned 5 here, but there's, if you search for it and Google it a bit, you will find that there's even more than these. But these were the 5 that came to mind when I was trying to make a list here. And as I mentioned, outreach, it doesn't have to cost that much, aside from the time expenditure, of course, right? Because that, in the end, also equates to a certain amount of money. But the event itself, it really doesn't have to be that expensive. So, for example, for CSI Maastricht, the stuff we need is just some lab equipment. We have to prepare some materials, like the travel costs for the school to come to Maastricht, and that comes down to about 500 euros per session. So it's really not a huge amount of money we're talking about here. And the same thing about those mini internships, right? With the high school students, that also comes down to about 100 to 200 euros per group that comes over. So this is really not something that is a big issue for most departments to organize this. And of course, what's very important is to put an enthusiastic team together, because if you just really work together, you can really turn the outreach into a really fun experience for both the researchers and of course the people that you're targeting. And that brings me to the end. So I hope I didn't leave you as confused as this guy here is looking. But if you are, then I'd be very happy to answer your questions.
Thanks a lot, Dennie, for the very nice talk. Let me just stop the recording. And now it's time for questions. So who wants to be the first one? Don't be shy.
Well, I have a question. So to what extent do public outreach platforms like Wikipedia play a role in what you do?
As in, if we like put stuff on Wikipedia as well, or how do you mean?
Yeah, you could put stuff on Wikipedia or on Wikimedia Commons or anywhere in that ecosystem, or collaborate with projects on that ecosystem on specific issues, because there's wiki projects for essentially any topic and location or age group or whatever.
Yeah. So within Merlin, nothing much. I mean, I think there's a few Wikipedia pages where we contributed some knowledge, but that's quite limited. I do know that within university, I don't know if you're familiar with Wiki Pathways, for example, because that is also tied into Wikipedia.
Yes, I know some of the people involved in that, yes.
Oh, yeah, exactly. So that indeed would be one example how other departments in the university use Wikipedia also for outreach, yeah. But within Merlin, nothing very specific, at least not to that kind of a degree, for sure, not now.
Okay.
May I ask a question about the critical digital information? How much time is expended on going into the motives for misinformation and disinformation, the power relationships behind it, why convincing cases can be made for the false narrative, who is behind it, educating people on how to look at things, because it's a big danger in the world today, and science is being discredited with the help of commercial interests, fossil fuel industry, etc. So it's not a small topic, and it needs to be much more done for the veracity of the academic profession to stay relevant.
So what is the question exactly then? So how we can improve this, or?
No, specifically, what focus is there on looking at the motives behind misinformation and disinformation, rather than just trying to recognize what is true and false, but to actually highlight where this stuff comes from and why it's there.
Yeah. So that, of course, I mean, that's not something that we as a research institute are delving into, but I totally agree. It is really important also to understand why this is happening. For example, that example that of that video with the supposedly the cat being on, there is someone behind it who cuts out that piece of the video and then puts it online. So I was really thinking when I was just putting that slide together, thinking also, so I wonder who was the person who just deliberately cut it out, because it was just one long video and they just deliberately cut out that one piece and put that online. So I was really thinking, who is this person behind this, and what is their motivation? And of course, I have no idea, but I'm sure there are indeed bigger players in there that do this deliberately for some kind of a reason. That could indeed be companies, and there's financial interest involved in it, and it can just be misinformation also from other governments. Of course, we've had plenty of examples of those, right? Also, for example, with Russia being involved, we've seen that on the news as well. And of course, you can try and focus the energy on figuring out who is doing this, and that is being done. But then it's just going to be a yes/no game from you did it, no, we didn't, etc. But I think what was just more important is to try and educate people in just recognizing it, because then it doesn't matter who did it. It just means that whatever they're doing, it's not having the effect anymore. But that can be very difficult to to really educate people into being very critical with these kinds of things.
Yeah, the key point is that for the observer or the viewer to believe or disbelieve is often dependent on understanding the motive.
Mm-hmm. No, that's definitely true, and I mean, there's often also kind of a motive for the person believing it, for why they want to believe it.
Yeah.
But I think that motive is, of course, that also needs to be understood. But I think that one is probably easier to tackle because it often just comes from, I'd say, from a certain insecurity or just like an irrational fear of things, without being properly taught, how things actually work.
Yeah. Thanks.
Roloff, you are next, and then Raoul.
Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. I enjoyed that. My cousin is a big fan of Jelly, YouTube star, and I just checked it out. He has 22 million subscribers on YouTube. It's insane. I'm just very curious of your view on what we can learn from such influencers as scientists.
Wait, so who's this Jelly?
This is just a like he's putting game videos or whatever, right?
Yeah,
he's just like there are lots of them around. Which,
I know, but I
have
didn't know
so
this
many subscribers.
Yeah, so of course that is definitely, and there's also something that you saw actually during the pandemic, right? Because at some point the government also decided to get influencers involved. One being what's her name again? Who then later on said basically the opposite. I forgot her name. Terrible singer. And so indeed they got these people involved to kind of like persuade people and convince them in for example, just get yourself tested if you're having any complaints, and go and get your vaccination. So they can definitely play an important role for like the positive side of things, but of course the exact opposite can happen as well, right? So if you have this YouTuber with 22 million subscribers saying, hey, vaccines, it's all bullshit, you shouldn't get it, then that can also have a really, really strong effect. So that can kind of swing both ways, this kind of thing. But indeed, you see this tactic to get influencers involved with these kinds of campaigns more often. And it, of course, if it works, it's great. But like I said, it can also just go completely wrong and go the opposite way.
So, but what's our secret ingredient? Why do they get all this attention?
That is something I also really don't get, because you see people obsessed with these people and just subscribing and watching every video. I personally don't do it, so I don't get it. But maybe I'm just from a too old generation to get it. So that's really something to maybe ask also the younger generation why it is that they're so into it. But it seems to work, right? Because some of them, they really have so many subscribers, and they definitely have a massive influence on people.
Thanks.
Raoul?
Okay. Thank you, Marcus, and thank you, Dennie, for this presentation, and Raúl Zuritamilla from Faculty ITC. So I have two questions, if I may. I would like to start with the first one. I think it's maybe the easiest one. So I'm thinking of the role of citizen science. We have now a shaping expert group in Twente focusing on citizen science. It's also something that we do in my faculty at ITC. And I see citizen science as a science, but also as a way to really connect with the public and do this public scientific outreach that we are discussing. But I didn't see it featuring very prominently in your presentations. I was wondering if you have experience or if this is something that is being discussed in Maastricht.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's a very good point indeed, and I didn't include it because I simply completely forgot about it. But it's a very good example. It's kind of like in a way a hybrid way, right? Because it's both outreach, but of course it's also a way of doing science, and it perfectly fits within the open science under the open science umbrella. Actually, with that, if you remember that circle with the 6 ones around it, yeah. I have a different version of that picture where citizen science is actually mentioned in it, but I, for some reason, chose that one. But definitely, it's a really great example, and we do have experience with it, not within Merlin, But for example, in our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, they have, I think, multiple citizen science projects going on. And in fact, the Fair Coffee events that we're organizing, right? So the first one we did this year was from a PhD student who has a citizen science project where she involves people from the public to help identify very old scientific illustrations in these very old books. And that was actually a very fascinating presentation, also, because also it's something that we often don't hear anything about, right? So it's really nice to hear stories from different faculties as well. So there it is happening, and because I know from her that there's also other initiatives going on there. But within like our faculty, so health, medicine, life sciences, I'm not aware of any of such projects, but they might also exist.
Okay, thank you. Now the second one, we are running out of time, so I will try to compress it, but I think I hope it's a topic that we can discuss maybe offline. So when I tell people about open science, I always tell them that if they want their children to live and love science, that is the way. I mean, if we keep on building this ivory tower, and we are going to take science away from our children, I think. And in your circle, you refer to your circle. So I talk about open educational resources, and we know that opening something is not enough. So for example, you also had an example in your presentation where this is too complex. So together with open educational resources, people are starting to talk about open pedagogy. So also pedagogical approaches so that people can use the material that is released to the public space. Mm-hmm. And I think that you also touch upon a little bit the recognition and reward. But I would like to challenge a little bit this idea in the Netherlands that open science open access is a top priority and it should become 100%. Because opening up papers for scientists is not going to help with public outreach and science communication. Mm-hmm. So like with the open educational resources, we have the open pedagogy. I would say that together with open access, we also need a proper strategy of scientific communication. And if not, it's unbalanced. And I see this unbalance. So mm-hmm. I just like to hear maybe yours and others' opinion on whether we are making a good move by establishing such a strong target without thinking about scientific communication and really connecting with the overall public.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Because it is indeed just opening it up. It's basically just saying, here you have a whole bunch of data. Good luck with it, and not my problem anymore. And that is kind of the thing that's happening there. Of course, for scientists, it's wonderful, right? But they have the tools and the skills, etc., to make heads or tails of it. But if we really want to share it with people, that would require an entirely different way of disseminating the knowledge, right? What you then could think of, for example, is that every paper kind of comes with a layman's summary of what happened in that paper. That could already be one way of doing it. That might actually also be an interesting thing, because it's kind of the same when you write a thesis. Often it's also associated with a layman's summary for like the average person in society to also understand what happened there. So that could be one way of doing it. But it would be nice that if indeed we're now really in the middle of this open access revolution, that this is something that kind of happens together with that, right? Instead of first opening everything up and then kind of having to go back again to everything and you make that twist to it. Having said that, I do wonder if it's valuable for every type of science that's happening, right? I can also imagine that some things are just too niche and too complex maybe to really explain. But yeah, that can be argued, of course. I don't know if anyone else has an opinion on that.
Can I ask one short question? Sure. It's interesting to hear your presentation, and I must say, well, I have a background in science communication research, so I'm a researcher in science communication. It was really interesting to hear what you were saying about outreach. But I was wondering if you also would consider engaging with people or citizens in other ways as important to science communication or science outreach. So that's not telling people, but more engaging with them in other ways. Would you consider that also, important for scientists to do?
Yeah, definitely. So indeed, like the lectures, for example, that is a very one-directional. You just tell what you have to say. But for example, with that CSI Maastricht thing that we have with the kids, right? That's a very interactive way of dealing with kids in this case, and also with the patient organizations that we have these meetings. But there's also a nice back and forth kind of discussion.
Yeah.
So, and those are very valuable because there you really get input back. And with a lecture, you usually don't really get that, right?
Yeah,
so
true. With patient organizations, it's already much different, developed already with a lot of interactions and feedback, also feeding into in the research topics or the research researchers are doing, I guess. Yeah. Interesting.
What we also usually see is that those types of activities where you have that interaction, that's also the ones that that researchers get the most value out of, right? Not just in terms of what they gain from it, but also just the amount of fun, right? So the motivation is that it can be a lot of fun to interact with people and understand what they're thinking.
Yeah, and maybe one tip for people who are thinking that their research is not so interesting for public outreach. What I did after I completed my PhD is I became a volunteer at the Science Cafe. So I organized the meetings with the scientists. But I consider that also important because, it enables also science communication or scientific outreach in a different way.
Indeed, I think we've also done that a few times in the past with these science cafes. That's also a great thing to participate.
Thanks.
All right, the hour is over. So Dennie, thanks again for the very nice presentation.
You're welcome.
Thanks to our participants for the nice discussion. And have a good afternoon. And then I see you in September.
Bye-bye.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.